They would both listen. The French governess had left that autumn for Paris, and now nobody knew what he did there in his room. The wallpaper was white, and higher up was a blue band on which were drawn gray geese and ginger puppies. A goose advanced on a pup, and so on 38 times around the entire room. An attaché supported a globe and stuffed squirrel brought once on Palm Sunday at the Catkin Fair. A green clockwork locomotive peeped out from beneath the flounces of an armchair. It was a nice, bright room, gay wallpaper, gay objects. There were also books written by his father, with red and gold embossed bindings, a handwritten inscription on the first page. I earnestly hope that my son will always treat animals and people the same way as Tony, and a big exclamation mark, or, I write this book thinking of your future, my son. These inscriptions inspired him in a vague feeling of shame for his father, and the books themselves were as boring as Korolenko's The Blind Musician or Goncharov's The Frigate Palace. A large volume of Pushkin was a picture of thick-lipped, curly-haired boy on it, was never opened. On the other hand, there were two books, both given him by his aunt, with which he had fallen in love for his whole life, holding them in his memory as if under a magnifying glass, and experiencing them so intensely that 20 years later, when he read them over again, he saw only a dryish paraphrase and abridged edition, as if they had been outstanced by an unrepeatable, immortal image that he had retained. But it was not a thirst for distant peregrinations that forced him to follow on the heels of Phileas Fogg, nor was it boyish inclination for mysterious adventures that drew him to the house on Baker Street, where the lanky detective with a hawk profile, giving himself an injection of cocaine, would dreamily play the violin. Only much later did he clarify in his own mind what it was that had thrilled him about those two books. It was the exact and relentlessly unfolding pattern. Phileas, the dummy in the top hat, wending his complex, elegant way with its justifiable sacrifices, now on an elephant bought for $1 million, now on a ship of which half has to be burned for fuel, and Sherlock endowing logic with the glamour of a daydream, Sherlock composing a monograph on the ash of all known sorts of cigars, with this ash as with a talisman, progressing through a crystal labyrinth of possible deductions to one radiant conclusion. The conjurer, whom his parents engaged to perform on Christmas Day, somehow managed to blend itself. Briefly, both Fogg and Holmes, the strange pleasure which Luzhin experienced on that day obliterated all unpleasantness that accompanied the performance, since cautious and frequent requests, to invite your school friends never led to anything. Luzhin Sr., confident that it would be both enjoyable and useful, got in touch with two acquaintances whose children attended the same school, and he also invited the children of a distant relative, two quiet, flabby little boys and a pale girl with a thick braid of black hair. All the boys invited wore sailor suits and smelled of hair oil. Two of them Luzhin recognized with horror as Bernachev and Rosen from Class 3, who at school were always dressed sloppily and behaved violently. "Well, here we are," said Luzhin Sr., joyfully holding his son by the shoulder slowly sliding out from under his hand. "Now I'll leave you alone. Get to know one another and play for a while, and later you'll be called. We'll have a surprise for you." Half an hour later, he went in to call them. In the room, there was silence. The little girl was sitting in a corner and leafing through the supplement to the review. Neva, the cornfield, looking for pictures. Bernachev and Rosen were self-consciously sitting on the sofa, both very red and shiny with pomade. The flabby nephews wandered around the room, examining without interest the English woodcuts on the walls, the globe, the squirrel, and the long-since-broken pedometer lying on the table. Luzhin himself, also wearing a sailor suit with a whistle on a white cord on his chest, was sitting on a hard chair by the window, glowering and biting his thumbnail. But the conjurer made up for everything, and even when on the following day Bernachev and Rosen, by this time their real disgusting selves, came up to him at school hall and bowed low, afterwards breaking into vulgar guffaws of laughter and quickly departing arm in arm and swaying from side to side. Even then, his mockery was unable to break the spell. Upon his sullen request, whatever he said nowadays, his brows came painfully together. His mother brought him from the bazaar a large box, painted a mahogany color, and a book of tricks, with a bemolded gentleman in evening dress on the cover, lifting a rabbit by its ears. Inside the box were smaller boxes with false bottoms, a wand covered with starry paper, a pack of crude cards, where the pictures were half-jacks and half-kings and half-asleep in uniforms, a folding top hat with compartments, a rope with two good wooden gadgets at the ends whose function was unclear, and there were also coquettish little envelopes containing powders for tinting water blue, red, and green. The book was much more entertaining, and Luzhin had no difficulty in learning several card tricks, which he spent hours showing to himself before the mirror. He found a mysterious pleasure, a vague promise of still unfathomed delights in the crafty and accurate way the trick would come out, but still there was something missing. He could not grasp that secret which the conjurer had evidently mastered in order to be able to pluck a ruble out of the air, or extract the 7 of clubs, tacitly chosen by the audience from the ear of an embarrassed Rosen. The complicated accessories described in the book irritated him. The secret for which he strove was simplicity, harmonious simplicity, which can amaze one far more than the most intricate magic. In the written report on his progress that was sent at Christmas, in this extremely detailed report, where under the rubric of general remarks they spoke at length, pleonastically, of his lethargy, apathy, sleepiness, and sluggishness, were marks replaced by epithets. There turned out to be one unsatisfactory in Russian language and several barely satisfactories, among other things, in mathematics. However, it was just at this time that he had become extraordinarily engrossed in a collection of problems entitled Merry Mathematics, and fantastical misbehavior of numbers, and the wayward frolics of geometric lines, and everything that the schoolbook lacked. He experienced both bliss and horror in contemplating the way an inclined line, rotating spoke-like, slid upwards along another vertical one, in an example illustrating the mysteries of parallelism. The vertical one was infinite, like all lines, and the inclined one, also infinite, sliding along it and rising ever higher as the angle decreased, was doomed to eternal motion, for it was impossible for it to slip off, and the point of their intersection, together with his soul, glided upwards along an endless path. But with the aid of a ruler he forced them to unlock. He simply withdrew them parallel to one another, and this gave him the feeling that out there in infinity, where he had forced the inclined line to jump off, an unthinkable catastrophe had taken place, an inexplicable miracle, and he lingered long in those heavens where the earthly lines go out of their mind. For a while he found an illusory relief in jigsaw puzzles. At first they were simply childish ones, consisting of large pieces cut out with rounded teeth at the edges like petit beurre cookies, which interlocked so tenaciously that it was impossible to lift whole sections of the puzzle without breaking them. But that year there came from England the fad of jigsaw puzzles invented for adults, puzzles, as they called them at the best toy shop in Petersburg, which were cut out of extraordinary ingenuity, pieces of all shapes, from a simple disc, part of a future blue sky, to the most intricate forms rich in corners, capes, isthmuses, cunning projections which did not allow you to tell where they were supposed to fit, whether they were to fill up the piebald hide of a cow, already almost completed, or whether this dark border on a green background was the shadow of the crook of a shepherd, whose ear and part of it whose head were plainly visible in a more outspoken piece. And when a cow's haunch gradually appeared on the left and on the right against some foliage, a hand with a shepherd's pike, and when the empty space above became built up with heavenly blue, and the blue disk fitted smoothly into the sky, Luzhin felt wonderfully stirred by the precise combinations of these varicolored pieces that formed at the last moment an intelligible picture. Some of these brain twisters were very expensive and consisted of several thousand pieces. They were bought by this young aunt, a gay, tender, red-haired aunt, and he would spend hours bent over a card table in a drawing-room, measuring with his eyes each projection before trying it, if it could fit in this or that gap, and attempting to determine by scarcely perceptible signs the essence of the picture in advance. From the next room, full of these noisome guests, his aunt would plead, "For goodness sake, don't lose any of the pieces." Sometimes his father would come in, look at the puzzle, and stretch out a hand to tableward, saying, "Look at this, undoubtedly goes here." And Luzhin, without looking round, would mutter, "Rubbish, rubbish, don't interfere," and his father would cautiously apply his lips to the tufted top of his son's head, and depart, past the gilded chairs, past the vast mirror, past the reproduction of Prune taking her bath, past the piano, a large silent piano shod with thick glass and caparisoned with a brocaded cloth. 3. Only in April, during the Easter holidays, did that inevitable day come for Luzhin, when the whole world suddenly went dark as if someone had thrown a switch, and in the darkness only one thing remained brilliantly lit, a newborn wonder, a dazzling islet, on which his whole life were destined to be concerned. The happiness onto which he fastened came to stay. That April day froze forever, while somewhere else the movement of seasons, the city spring, the country summer, continued in a different plane, dim currents which barely affected him. It began innocently. On the anniversary of his father-in-law's death, Luzhin Sr. organized a musical evening in his apartment. He himself had little understanding of music. He nursed a secret, shameful passion for La Traviata, and concerts listened to the piano only at the beginning, after which he contented himself with watching the pianist's hands, reflected in the black varnish, but willingly he had to organize that musical evening at which works of his late father-in-law would be played. As it was, the newspapers had been silent for too long. The oblivion was complete, leaden, hopeless, and his wife kept repeating, with a tremulous smile, that it was all an intrigue, 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 that even during his lifetime others had envied her father's genius, and that now they wanted to suppress his posthumous fame. Wearing a black open-necked dress and a superb diamond dog collar with a permanent expression of drowsy amiability on her puffy white face, she received the guests quietly, without exclaiming, whispering to each a few rapid, soft-sounding words, but inwardly she was beset by shyness and kept looking about for her husband, who was moving back and forth with mincing steps, his starched shirt-front swelling cuirass-like out of his waistcoat, a genial, discreet gentleman in the first timid throes of literary venerability. Stark-naked again, sighed the editor of an art magazine, taking a passing look at Fearon, who was practically vivid as a result of the intensified light. At this point, young Luzhin cropped up under his feet and his head stroked. The boy recoiled. "How huge he's grown," said a woman's voice from behind. He hid behind someone's tails. "No, I beg your pardon," thundered about above his head. "Such demands must not be made on our press. Not at all huge, but on the contrary very small for his years." He wandered among the guests, trying to find a quiet spot. Sometimes somebody caught him by the shoulder and asked idiotic questions. The drawing-room looked especially crowded because of the gilded chairs which had been placed in rows. Someone carefully came through the door carrying a music stand. By imperceptible stages, Luzhin made his way to his father's study, where it was dark, and settled on a divan in the corner. From the distant drawing-room, through 2 rooms, came the tender wail of a violin. He listened sleepily, clasping his knees and looking at a chink of lacy light between the loosely closed curtains, through which a gas lamp from the street shone lilac-tinged white. From time to time a faint glimmer sped over the ceiling in a mysterious arc, and a gleaming dot showed on the desk. He did not know what, perhaps on a facet of paperweight, in the guise of a heavy crystal egg or reflection of glass on a desk photograph. He had almost dozed off when suddenly he started at the ring of a telephone on the desk, and it became immediately clear that the gleaming dot was on the telephone support. The butler came in from the dining room, turned on in passing a light which illuminated only the desk, placed the receiver to his ear, and without noticing Luzhin went out again, having carefully laid the receiver on the leather-bound blotter. A minute later he returned, accompanying a gentleman who, as soon as he entered the circle of light, picked up the receiver from the desk, with his other hand groped for the back of the desk chair. The servant closed the door behind him, cutting off the distant ripple of music. "Hello," said the gentleman. Luzhin looked at him out of the darkness, fearing to move, and embarrassed by the fact of complete stranger, was reclining so comfortably at his father's desk. "No, I've already played," he said, looking upwards, while his white, restless hand fidgeted with something at the desk. A cab clip-clopped hollowly over the wooden pavement. "I think so," said the gentleman. Luzhin could see his profile, an ivory nose, black hair, a bushy eyebrow. "Frankly, I don't know why you were calling me here," he said quietly, continuing to fiddle with something on the desk. "If it was only to check up, you silly," he laughed, and commenced to swing one foot on its patent leather shoe regularly back and forth. Then he placed the receiver very skillfully between his ear and shoulder, and, replying intermittently with yes and no and perhaps, used both hands to pick up the object he had been playing with on the desk. It was a polished box that had been presented to his father a few days before. Luzhin Jr. still had not had a chance to look inside, but now he watched the gentleman's hands with curiosity. But the latter did not open the box immediately. "Me too," he said, many times, many times. "Good night, little girl." Having hung up the receiver, he sighed and opened the box. However, he turned in such a way that Luzhin could see nothing from behind his black shoulder. Luzhin moved cautiously, but a cushion slid onto the floor, and the gentleman quickly looked around. "What are you doing here?" he asked, spying Luzhin in the dark corner. My, how bad it is to eavesdrop." Luzhin remained silent. "What's your name?" asked the gentleman amiably. Luzhin slid off the divan and came closer. A number of card figures lay closely packed in the box. "Excellent chessmen," said the gentleman. "Does Papa play?" "I don't know," said Luzhin. "And do you play yourself?" Luzhin shook his head. "That's a pity. You should learn. At 10 I was already a good player. How old are you?" Carefully the door was opened. Luzhin Sr. came in on tiptoe. He had been prepared to find the violinist still talking on the telephone, and thought to whisper very tactfully, "Continue, continue, but when you finish the audience would very much like to hear something more." "Continue, continue," he said mechanically, and was all short when seeing his son. No, I've already finished," replied the violinist, getting up. "Excellent chessman. Do you play?" "Indifferently," said Luzhin Sr. "What are you doing here? You come too and listen to the music. What a game, said the violinist, tenderly closing the box. "Combinations like melodies. You know, I can simply hear the moves. In my opinion, one needs great mathematical skill for chess," Luzhin Sr. said. "And in that respect, they are waiting for you, Maestro. I would rather have a game," laughed the violinist as he left the room. The game of the gods, infinite possibilities, a very ancient invention, said Luzhin Sr., and looked around at his son. What's the matter? Come with us. But before reaching the drawing-room, Luzhin contrived to tarry in the dining room where the table was laid with refreshments. There he took a plateful of sandwiches and carried it away to his room. He ate while he undressed, and then ate in bed. He had already put the light out when his mother looked in and bent over him, the diamonds around her neck glinting in the half-light. He pretended to be asleep. She went away and was a long, long time, so as not to make a noise, closing the door. He woke up next day with a feeling of incomprehensible excitement. The April morning was bright and windy. The wooden street pavements had a violet sheen. Above the street near the palace arch, an enormous red, blue, white flag swelled elastically, the sky showing through it in 3 different tints, mauve, indigo, and pale blue. As always on holidays, he went for a walk with his father, but these were not the former walks of his childhood. The midday cannon no longer frightened him, as his father's conversation was unhearable, for finding a pretext in last night's concert. He kept thinking that it would be a good idea to take up music. For lunch, there was the remains of the Pascal cream cheese, now a squat little cone in a grayish shading on its round summit, and a still untouched Easter cake. His aunt, the same sweet copper-haired aunt, second cousin to his mother, was gay in the extreme, threw cake crumbs across the table and related that for the 25 rubles Lapham was going to give her a ride in his Antoinette monoplane, which, by the way, was unable to leave the ground for the 5th day, while Voisin, on the contrary, kept circling the aerodrome like clockwork, and moreover so low that he banked over the stands. One could even see the cotton wool in the pilot's ears. Luzhin, for some reason, remembered that morning that lunch was unusual brightness, the way you remember the day preceding a long journey. His father said it would be a good idea after lunch to drive to the islands beyond the Neva, where the clearings were carpeted with anemones, and while he was speaking, the young aunt landed a crumb right in father's mouth. His mother remained silent, suddenly, after which the second course she got up, trying to conceal her face twitching with restrained tears, and repeating under her breath, "It's nothing, nothing, it'll pass in a moment," hastily left the dining room. Father threw his napkin on the table and followed her. Luzhin never discovered exactly what had happened, but passing along the corridor with his aunt, he heard subdued sobs from his mother's room, and his father's voice remonstrating loudly, repeating the phrase, "imagining things." "Let's go away somewhere," whispered his aunt, in an embarrassed and nervous manner. And they entered the study where a band of sunbeams, in which spun tiny particles of dust, which focused on an overstuffed armchair. She lit a cigarette, and folds of smoke started to sway, soft and transparent, in the sunbeams. This was the only person in whose presence he did not feel constrained, and now it was especially pleasant, a strange silence in the house and a kind of expectation of something. "Well, let's play some game," said his aunt hurriedly, and took him by the neck from behind. "What a thin little neck you have! One can clasp it with one hand. Do you know how to play chess?" asked Luzhin stealthily, and freeing his head, he rubbed the cheek against the delightful bright blue silk of her sleeve. "The game of snap would be better," she said absent-mindedly. A door banged somewhere. She winced and turned her face in the direction of the noise. "Lightning." "No, I want to play chess," said Luzhin. "It's complicated, my dear. You can't learn it in an instant." He went to the desk and found the box, which was standing behind a desk photograph. His aunt got up to take an ashtray, ruminating, crooning in conclusion of some thought of hers. "That would be terrible. That would be terrible. Here," said Luzhin, and put the box down on a low inlaid Turkish table. "You need the board as well," she said, "and you know it would be better for me to teach you checkers. It's simpler." "No, chess," said Luzhin, and unrolled an oilcloth board. "First, let's paste the pieces correctly," began his aunt with a sigh. "White here, black over there. King and queen next to each other. These here are the officers. These are the horses, and these at each corner the cannons. Now," suddenly she froze, holding a piece in midair and looking at the door. "Wait," she said anxiously. "I think I left my handkerchief in the dining room. I'll be right back." She opened the door but returned immediately. "Let it go," she said, and again sat down. "No, don't set them out without me. You'll do it the wrong way. This is called a pawn. Now watch how they all move. The horse gallops, of course." Luzhin sat on the carpet with his shoulder against his knee and watched her hand with a thin platinum bracelet, picking up the chessmen and putting them down. "The queen is the most mobile," he said with satisfaction, and adjusted the piece with his finger, since it was standing not quite in the center of the square. "And this is how one piece eats another," said his aunt, as if pushing it out and taking its place. "The pawns do this obliquely. When you can take the king but he can move out of the way, it's called check, and when he's got nowhere to go, it's mate. So your object is to take my king, and I have to take yours. You see how long it takes to explain? Perhaps we can play another time, eh?" "No, now," said Luzhin, and suddenly kissed her hand. "That was sweet of you," said his aunt softly. I never expected such tenderness. You are a nice little boy, after all. Please, let's play, said Luzhin, and moving in a kneeling position on the carpet, reached the low table. But at that moment she got up from her seat so abruptly that she brushed the board with her skirt and knocked off several pieces. In the doorway stood his father. Go to your room, he said, glancing briefly at his son. Luzhin, who was being sent out of a room for the first time in his life, remained as he was on his knees out of sheer astonishment. Did you hear? Said his father. Luzhin flushed and began to look for the fallen pieces on the carpet. Hurry up, said his father with a thunderous voice, such as he had never used before. His aunt hastily began to put the pieces away into their box. Her hands trembled. One pawn would just not go in. Now take it, she said. He slowly rolled up the oilcloth board, and his face darkened by a sense of deep injury, took the box. He was unable to close the door behind him since both hands were full. His father took a swift stride and slammed the door so hard that Luzhin dropped the board, which immediately unfolded. He had to put the box down and roll up the thing again. Behind the door of the study there at first silence, then the crack of an armchair under his father's weight, then his aunt's breathless interrogative whisper. Luzhin reflected disgustedly that today everyone had gone mad and went to his room. There he immediately set out the pieces as his aunt had shown him, and considered them for a long time, trying to figure something out, after which he put them away very neatly in their box. From that day the chess set remained with him, and it was a long time before his father noticed its absence. From that day there was in his room a fascinating and mysterious toy, the use of which he has still not learned. From this day his aunt never again came to visit them. A week or so later, an empty gap occurred between the first and third lesson. The geography teacher had caught a cold. When 5 minutes had passed after the bell and still no one had come in, this ensued a premonition of happiness that it seemed the heart would not hold out. Should the glass door nonetheless now open, and the geography teacher, as was his habit, come dashing out most as a run into the room? Only Luzhin was indifferent. Bent low over his desk, he was sharpening a pencil, trying to make the point as sharp as a pin. An excited din swelled around him. Our bliss, it seemed, was bound to be realized. Sometimes, however, there were unbearable disappointments. In place of the sick teacher, the predatory little mathematics teacher would come creeping into the room, and having closed the door soundlessly, would begin to select pieces of chalk from the edge beneath the blackboard, with an evil smile on his face. But a full 10 minutes elapsed, and no one appeared. The din grew louder. From an excess of happiness, someone banged a desk lid. The class tutor sprang up out of nowhere. "Absolute quiet," he said. "I want absolute quiet. Valentin Ivanovich is sick. Occupy yourselves with something, but there must be absolute quiet." He went away. Large fluffy clouds shone outside the window. Something gurgled and dripped. Sparrows chirped. Blissful hour, bewitching hour. Luzhin apathetically began to sharpen yet another pencil. Gromov was telling some story in a hoarse voice, pronouncing strange obscene words with gusto. Petrushev begged everyone to explain to him how we know that they are equal to two right-angled ones, and suddenly behind him Luzhin distinctly heard a special sound. Wooden and rattly, the costume to grow hot and his heart skip a beat. Cautiously he turned around. Krebs and the only quiet boy in the class were nimbly setting out like little chessmen on a 6-inch board. The board was on the desk bench between them. They sat extremely uncomfortably sideways. Luzhin, forgetting to finish sharpening his pencil, went up to them. The players took no notice of them. The quiet boy, when trying many years later to remember his schoolmate Luzhin, never recalled that casual chess game played during an empty hour. Mixing up dates, he extracted from the past a vague impression of Luzhin's once winning a school match. Something itched in his memory, but he could not get at it. "There goes the tower," said Krebs. Luzhin followed his hand, thinking with a tremor of momentary panic that his aunt had not told him the names of all the pieces, but tower turned out to be synonym for cannon. "I didn't see you could take, that's all," said the other. "All right, take your move back," said Krebs. With gnawing envy and irritating frustration, Luzhin watched the game, striving to perceive these harmonious patterns the musician had spoken of, and feeling vaguely that in some way or other he understood the game better than these two, although he was completely ignorant of how it could be conducted, why this was good and bad, and then what one would do to penetrate the opposite king's camp with no losses. And there was one kind of move that pleased him very much, amusing in its sleekness. Krebs' king slid up to the piece he called tower, and the tower jumped over the king. Then he saw the other king come out from behind its pawns, one that had been knocked out like a tooth, and began to step distractedly back and forth. "Check," said Krebs, "check," and the stunned king leaped to one side. "You can't go here, and you can't go here either. Check, I'm taking your queen. Check." At this point he lost a piece of himself. He began insisting that he should replay his move. The class bully filliped Luzhin on the back and his head, simultaneously with his other hand knocked the board to the floor. For the second time in his life, Luzhin noticed how unstable a thing chess was. And the following morning, while still lying in bed, he made an unprecedented decision. He unusually He usually went to school in a cab and always made a careful study of the cab's drive number, dividing it up in a special way in order the better to store it away in his memory and extract it thence whole, should he require it. But today he did not go as far as the school and forgot in his excitement to memorize the number. Fearfully glancing around, he got out at Koronaviraya Street, and by a circular route, avoiding the region of the school, reached Sergeyevskaya Street. On the way, he happened to run into the geography teacher, who, with enormous strides, a briefcase under his arm, was rushing in the direction of the school, blowing his nose and expectorating phlegm as he went. Luzhin turned aside so abruptly that a mysterious object rattled heavily in his satchel. Only when the teacher, blind like the wind, had swept past him did Luzhin become aware that he was standing before the hairdresser's window, and that the frizzled heads of 3 waxen ladies with pink nostrils were staring directly at him. He took a deep breath and swiftly walked along the wet sidewalk, and unconsciously trying to adjust his steps so that his heel always landed on a joint between 2 paving slabs. But the slabs were all of different widths, and this hampered his walk. Then he stepped down onto the pavement in order to escape temptation, and sloshed in the mud along the edge of the sidewalk. Finally, he caught sight of the house he wanted, plum-colored, with naked old men straining up on a balcony and stained glass in the front door. He turned into the gate and passed a spur-stone, showing the white marks of pigeons, stole across an inner court where 2 individuals with rolled-up sleeves were washing a dazzling carriage, went up a staircase and rang the bell. "She's still asleep," said the maid, looking at him with surprise. "Wait here, won't you? I'll let Madame know in a while." Luzhin shrugged off his satchel in a business-like fashion, and laid it beside him on the table, which also bore a porcelain inkwell, a blotting case embroidered with beads, an unfamiliar picture of his father, a book in one hand, a finger of the other pressed to his temple, and from nothing better to do, commenced to count the different hues in the carpet. He had been in his room only once before, last Christmas, when, on his father's advice, he had taken his aunt a large box of chocolates, half of which he had eaten himself, and the remainder of which he had arranged so that it would not be noticed. Up until just recently, his aunt had been at their place every day, but now she had stopped coming, and there was something in the air, an elusive interdiction, that prevented him from asking about it at home. Having counted up to 9 different shades, he shifted his gaze to the silk screen embroidered on the rushes and storks. He had just begun to wonder what similar storks were on the other side as well when at last his aunt came, her hair not yet done and wearing a kind of flowery kimono with sleeves like wings. "Where did you spring from?" she exclaimed. "And what about school? What a funny boy you are." 2 hours later he again emerged onto the street. His satchel, now empty, was so light that it bounced on his shoulder blades. He had to pass time somehow until the usual hour of return. He wandered into Tavrichesky Park, and the emptiness in his satchel gradually began to annoy him. In the first place, the thing he had left as a precaution with his aunt might somehow get lost before next time, and in the second place, it would have to come in handy at home during the evenings. He resolved to act differently in the future. "Family circumstances," he replied the next day when the teacher casually inquired why he had not been in school. On Thursday he left school early and missed 3 days in a row, explaining afterwards that he had a sore throat. On Wednesday he had a relapse. On Saturday he was late for the first lesson, even though he had left home earlier than usual. On Sunday he amazed his mother by announcing that he had been invited to a friend's house, and he was only 5 hours. On Wednesday school broke up early. It was one of those wonderful blue dusty days at the very end of April, when at the end of school term is already imminent and such indolence overcomes one. But he did not get home until much later than usual, and then there was a whole week of absence, a rapturous, intoxicating week. The teacher telephoned his home to find out what the matter was with him. His father answered the phone. When Luzhin returned home around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his father's face was gray, his eyes bulging. His mother gasped as if deprived of her tongue, and then began to laugh unnaturally and hysterically with wails and cries. After a moment's confusion, father led him without a word into his study, and there, with arms folded across his chest, requested an explanation. Luzhin, holding the heavy and precious satchel under his arm, stared at the floor, wondering whether his aunt was capable of betrayal. "Kindly give me an explanation," repeated his father. "She was incapable of betrayal, and in any case, how could she know where he had been caught?" "You refuse?" asked his father. "Besides, she somehow seemed even to like his truancy." "Now listen," said his father conciliatorily. "Let's talk as friends." Luzhin sighed and sat on the arm of a chair, continuing to look at the floor. "As friends," he repeated to his father, and still more soothingly. "So now it turns out you have missed school several times. So now I would like to know where you have been and what you have been doing. I can even understand that, for instance, the weather is fine and one gets the urge to go for walks." "Yes, I get the urge," said Luzhin indifferently, growing bored. His father wanted to know where exactly he had gone for the walk, and whether his need of walks was long-standing. He reminded him that every man has his duty as a citizen, as a family man, a soldier, and as a schoolboy. Luzhin yawned. "Go to your room," said father hopelessly. And when his son had left, he stood for a long time in the middle of his study and looked at the door with blank horror. His wife, who had been listening from the next room, came in, sat on the edge of the divan, and began to burst into tears. "He cheats," she kept repeating, "just as you cheat. I'm surrounded by cheats." He merely shrugged his shoulders and thought how sad life was, how difficult to do one's duty, not to meet any more, not to telephone, not to go where he was irresistibly drawn, and now this trouble with his son, this oddity, this stubbornness, a sad state of affairs, a very sad state. In grandfather's former study, which even on the hottest days was the dampest room in their country house, no matter how much they opened the windows, that looked straight out into the grim, dark fir trees, whose foliage was so thick and intricate that it was impossible to say where one tree ended and another began, in this uninhabited room where a bronze boy with a violin stood on the bare desk, there was also an unlocked bookcase containing the thick volumes of an extinct illustrated magazine. Luzhin would swiftly leaf through them until he reached the page where, between them, a poem by Korinski, crowned with a harp-shaped vignette, and a miscellany section containing information about human intestine, there was the woodcut of a chessboard. Not a single picture could arrest Luzhin's hand as it leafed through the volumes, neither a celebrated Niagara Falls nor starving Indian children, pot-bellied like skeletons, nor an attempted assassination of the King of Spain. The life of the world passed by with a hasty rustle, and suddenly stopped, the treasure diagram problems opening his entire games. At the beginning of the summer holidays, he had sorely missed his aunt and the old gentleman with the bunch of flowers, especially that fragrant old man, smelling at times of violets and at times of lilies of the valley, depending on what flowers he had brought to Luzhin's aunt. Usually he would arrive just right. A few minutes after Luzhin's aunt had glanced at her watch and left the house. "Never mind, let's wait a while," the old man would say, removing the damp paper from his bouquet, and Luzhin would draw up an armchair for him to the table where the chessmen had already been set out. The appearance of the old gentleman with the flowers had provided him with a way out of a rather awkward situation. After 3 or 4 truancies from school, it became apparent that his aunt really had no aptitude for chess. As the game proceeded, her pieces would conglomerate in an unseemly jumble, out of which there would suddenly dash an exposed, helpless king. But the old gentleman played divinely. The first time his aunt, pulling on her gloves, had said rapidly, "Unfortunately I must leave, but you stay on and play chess with my nephew. Thank you for the wonderful lilies of the valley." The first time the old man had sat down and sighed, "It's a long time since I touched. Now, young man, left or right?" The first time, when after a few moves Luzhin's ears were burning and there was nowhere to advance, it seemed to Luzhin he was playing a completely different game from the one his aunt had taught him. The board was bathed in fragrance. The old man called the officer a bishop and the tower a rook, and whenever he made a move that was fatal for his opponent, he would immediately take it back as if disclosing the mechanism of an expensive instrument. He would show the way his opponents should have played in order to avert disaster. He won the first 15 games without the slightest effort, not pondering his moves for a moment, but during the 16th game he suddenly began to think and won with difficulty, while on the last day, the day he drove up with a whole bush of lilac for which no place could be found, and the boy's aunt darted about on tiptoe in her bedroom, and then presumably left by the back door. On this last day, after a long, exciting struggle during which the old man revealed a capacity for breathing hard through the nose, Luzhin perceived something. Something was set free within him, something cleared up, and the mental myopia that had been painfully beclouding his chest vision disappeared. "Well, well, it's a draw," said the old man. He moved his queen back and forth a few times the way you move a lever of a broken machine, and repeated, "A draw, perpetual check." Luzhin also tried the lever to see if it would work, wiggled it, and sat still, staring stiffly at the board. "You'll go far," said the old man. "You'll go far if you continue on the same lines. Tremendous progress. Never saw anything like it before. You'll go very, very far." It was this old man who explained to Luzhin the simple method of notation in chess, and Luzhin, replaying the games given in the magazine, soon discovered in himself a quality he had once envied when his father used to tell somebody at the table that he personally was unable to understand how his father-in-law could read and score for hours and hear in his mind all the movements of the music as he ran his eye over the notes, now smiling, now frowning, and sometimes turning back like a reader, checking in detail in a novel a name, the time of the year. It must be a great pleasure, his father had said, to assimilate music in its natural state. It was a similar pleasure that Luzhin himself now began to experience as he skimmed fluently over the letters and numbers representing moves. At first he ran to replay the immortal games that remained from further tournaments. He would rapidly glance over the notes of chess and silently move the pieces on his board. Now and then, this or that move provided in the text an exclamation or a question mark, depending on whether it had been beautifully or wretchedly played, would be followed by several series of moves in parentheses, since that remarkable move branched out like a river, and every branch had to be traced to its conclusion before a returned to the main channel. These possible continuations that explained the essence of blunder or foresight, Luzhin gradually ceased to reconstruct actually on the board, and contented himself with perceiving their melody mentally through the sequence of symbols and signs. Similarly, he was able to read a game already perused once without using the board at all, and this was all the more pleasant in that he did not have to fiddle about with the chessmen while constantly listening for someone coming. The door, it is true, was locked. He would open it unwillingly after the brass handle had been jiggled many times, and Luzhin Sr., coming in to see what his son was doing in that damp, uninhabited room, would find his son restless and sullen with red ears. On the desk lay the bound volumes of the magazine, and Luzhin Sr. would be seized by suspicion that his son might have been looking for pictures of naked women. Why do you lock yourself up?" he would ask, and little Luzhin would draw his head unto his shoulders, and with hideous clarity imagine his father looking under the sofa and finding the chess set. "The air in here is really icy, and what's so interesting about these old magazines? Let's go and see if there are any red mushrooms under the fir trees." Yes, they were there, those edible red bullets. Green needles adhered to their delicately brick-colored caps, and sometimes a blade of grass would leave on one of them a long narrow trace. Their undersides might be holy, and occasionally a yellow slug would be sitting there, and Luzhin Sr. would use his pocket-knife to clean the moss and soil from the thick, speckled gray root of each mushroom before placing it in the basket. His son followed behind him at a few paces' distance with his hands behind his back like a little old man, and not only did he look for mushrooms, but even refused to admire those his father, with little quacks of pleasure, unearthed himself, and sometimes plump and pale in dreary white dress that did not become her, Miss Luzhin would appear at the end of the avenue and hurry toward them, passing alternately through sunlight and shadow, and the dry leaves that never ceased to occur in northern woods would rustle beneath the slightly skewed high heels of her white slippers. On July days she slipped on the veranda steps and sprained her foot, and for a long time afterwards she lay in bed, either in her darkened bedroom or on the veranda, wearing a pink negligee, her face heavily powdered, and there would always be a small silver bowl with bouts de gomme, balls of hard candy, standing on a little table beside her. The foot was soon better, but she continued to recline, as if having made up her mind that this was to be her lot, that this was precisely her destiny in life. Summer was unusually hot. The mosquitoes gave no peace. All day long the shrieks of peasant girls bathing could be heard from the river, and on one such oppressive and voluptuous day, early in the morning, before the gadflies had yet begun to torment the black house daubed with pungent ointment, Luzhin Sr. stepped into the calash and was taken to the station to spend the day in town. "At least be reasonable. It's essential for me to see Silverstraub," he had said to his wife the night before, pacing about the bedroom in his mouse-colored dressing gown. "Really, how queer you are. Can't you see this is important? I myself would prefer not to go." But his wife continued to lie with her face thrust into the pillow, and her fat, helpless back shook with sobs. Nonetheless, in the morning he left, and his son, standing in the garden, saw the top part of the coachman and his father's hat skim along the serrated line of young firs that fenced off the garden from the road. That day Luzhin Jr. was in low spirits. All the games in the old magazine had been studied, all the problems solved, and he was forced to play with himself, but this ended inevitably in the exchange of all the pieces and of a dull draw. It was unbearably hot. The veranda cast a black triangular shadow on the bright sand. The avenue was paved with sunflecks. These spots, if you slitted your eyes, took on the aspect of regular light and dark squares. An intense, lattice-like shadow lay flat beneath the garden bench. The urns that stood on stone pedestals at the four corners of the terrace threatened one another across their diagonals. Swallows soared. Their flight recalled the motion of scissors swiftly cutting out some design. Not knowing what to do with himself, he wandered down the footpath by the river, and from the opposite bank came an ecstatic squeals and glimpses of naked bodies. He stole behind a tree trunk with a beating heart, peered at these flashes of white. A bird rustled in the branches, and taking fright, he quickly left the river and went back. He had lunch alone with the housekeeper, a taciturn, sallow-faced old woman who always gave off a slight smell of coffee. Afterwards, lolling on the drawing-room couch, he drowsily listened to all manner of sight sounds. To an oriole's cry in the garden, to the buzzing of a bumblebee that had flown in the window, to the tinkle of dishes on a tray being carried down from his mother's bedroom, and these limpid sounds were strangely transformed his reverie, and assumed the shape of bright, intricate patterns on a dark background, and in trying to unravel them he fell asleep. He was wakened by the steps of the maid dispatched by his mother. It was dim and cheerless in the bedroom. His mother drew him to her, but he braced himself and turned away so stubbornly she had to let him go. "Come, tell me something," she said softly. He shrugged his shoulders and picked at his knee with one finger. "Don't you want to tell me anything?" she asked, still more softly. He looked at the bedside table, put a bout de gomme in his mouth, and began to suck. He took a second, a third, and another, until his mouth was full of sweet, thudding and bumping balls. "Take some more. Take as many as you wish," she murmured, and stretching one hand from under the bedclothes, she tried to touch him and to stroke him. "You haven't got tanned at all this year," she said after a pause. "But perhaps I simply can't see. The light here is so dead, everything looks blue. Raise the Venetian blinds, please. Or, no, wait, stay, later." Having sucked his bout de gomme to the end, he inquired if he could leave. She asked him what he would do now, and he did not like to drive to the station and meet his father off at the 7 o'clock train. "Let me go," he said. "It smells of medicine in here." He tried to slide down the stairs the way they did at school, the way he never himself did it there, but the steps were too high. Beneath the staircase in a cupboard that had still not been thoroughly explored, he looked for magazines. He dug out one and found a checkers section in it, diagrams of stupid, clumsy, round blobs on their boards, but there was no chess. As he rummaged on, he kept coming across a bothersome herbarium album with dried edelweiss and purple leaves in it with inscriptions in pale violet ink, and a childish, thin-spun hand that was so different from his mother's present handwriting. Davos, 1885, Kachina, 1886. Wrathfully, he began to tear out the leaves and flowers, sneezing for the fine dust as he squatted on his haunches and scattered books. Then it got so dark beneath the stairs that the pages of the magazine he was again leafing through began to merge into a gray blur, and sometimes a small picture would trick him because it looked like a chess problem in the diffused darkness. He thrust the books back anyhow in the drawers and wandered into the drawing room, thinking listlessly that it must be well past 7 o'clock since the butler was lighting the kerosene lamps. Leaning on a cane and holding on to the banisters, his mother in mauve peignoir came heavily down the stairs, a frightened look on her face. "I don't understand why your father isn't here yet," she said, and moving with difficulty, she went out onto the veranda and began to peer down the road between the fir trunks that the setting sun banded with bright copper. He came only around 10, said he had missed the train, had been extremely busy, and dined with his publisher. No soup, thank you." He laughed and spoke very loudly and ate noisily, and Luzhin was struck by the feeling that his father was looking at him all the time as if staggered by his presence. Dinner graded into late evening tea. Mother, her elbow propped onto the table, silently slitted her eyes at her plate of raspberries, and the gayer her husband's stories became, the narrower her eyes grew. Then she got up and quietly left, and it seemed to Luzhin that all this had happened once before. He remained alone on the veranda with his father and was afraid to raise his head, feeling that strange searching stare at him the whole time. "How have you been passing the time?" asked his father suddenly. "What have you been doing?" "Nothing," replied Luzhin. "And what are you planning to do now?" asked Luzhin Sr., in the same tone of forced jollity, imitating his son's manner of using the formal plural for you. "Do you want to go to bed, or do you want to sit here with me?" Luzhin killed a mosquito and very cautiously stole a glance upward and sideways at his father. There was a crumb on his father's beard, and an unpleasantly mocking expression gleamed in his eyes. "Do you know what?" his father said, and the crumb jumped off. "Do you know what? Let's play some game. For instance, how about me teaching you chess?" He saw his son slowly blush, and taking pity on him, immediately added, "Or Kabbalah. There is a pack of cards over there in the table drawer." "But no chess set. We have no chess set," said Luzhin huskily, and again stole a cautious look at his father. "The good ones remained in town," said his father placidly, "but I think there are some old ones in the attic. Let's go take a look." And indeed, by the light of the lamp, his father held aloft, among all sorts of rubbish in a case, Luzhin found a chessboard, and again he had the feeling that all this had happened before. That open case, with a nail sticking out of its side, those dust-powdered books, that wooden chessboard with a crack down the middle, a small box with a sliding lid also came to light. It contained puny chessmen, and the whole time he was looking for the chess set, then carrying it down to the veranda, Luzhin tried to figure out whether it was by accident that his father had mentioned the chess, or whether he had noticed something, and the most obvious explanation did not occur to him, just as sometimes in solving a problem its key turns out to be a move that seemed barred, impossible, excluded quite naturally from the range of possible moves. And now, when the board had been placed on the illuminated table between the lamp and the raspberries, and its dust wiped off with a bit of newspaper, his father's face was no longer mocking. And Luzhin, forgetting his fear, forgetting his secret, felt permeated at once with proud excitement at the thought that he could, if he wanted, display his art. His father began to set out the pieces. One of the pawns was replaced by an absurd purple-colored affair in the shape of a tiny bottle. In place of one rook, there was a checker, the knights were headless, and the one horse's head that remained after the box had been emptied, leaving a small die on a red counter, turned out not to fit any of them. When everything had been set out, Luzhin suddenly made up his mind and muttered, "I already can play a little." "Who taught you?" asked his father without lifting his head. "I learned it at school," replied Luzhin. "Some of the boys could play." "Oh, fine," said his father, and added, quoting Pushkin's doomed duelist. Let's start, if you are willing. He has played chess since his youth, but only seldom and sloppily, with haphazard opponents, on serene evenings aboard a Volga steamer, in the foreign sanatorium where his brother was dying years ago, here in the country with a village doctor and unsociable man who periodically ceased calling on them, and all these chance games, full of oversights and sterile meditations, were for him little more than a moment of relaxation, or simply a means of decently preserving silence in the company of a person with whom conversation kept petering out. Brief, uncomplicated games, remarkable neither for ambition nor inspiration, which he always began in the same way, paying little attention to adversaries' moves. Although he made no fuss about losing, he secretly considered himself to be not at all a bad player, and told himself that if he ever lost, it was through absent-mindedness, a good nature, or a desire to enliven the game with daring sallies, which he considered that, with little application, it was possible, without theoretical knowledge, to refute any gambit out of the textbook. His son's passion for chess had so astounded him, seemed so unexpected, and at the same time so fateful and inescapable, so strange and awesome was it to sit on this bright veranda amid the black summer night, across from this boy whose tensed forehead seemed to expand and swell as soon as he bent over the pieces. All this was so strange and so awesome that Luzhin Sr. was incapable of thinking of the game. And while he feigned concentration, his attention wandered from the vague recollections of his illicit day in St. Petersburg that left a residue of shame, as it was better not to investigate, to the casual, easy gestures with which his son moved this or that piece. The game that lasted but a few minutes, where his son said, if you do this, it's mate, and if you do that, you lose your queen. And he, confused, took his move back and began to think properly, inclining his head first to the left and then to the right, slowly stretching out his fingers toward the queen and quickly snatching them away again as if burned, while in the meantime his son calmly and with uncharacteristic tidiness put the taken pieces into their box. Finally Luzhin Sr. made his move, whereupon he started a devastation of his positions, and then he laughed unnaturally and knocked his king over in a sign of surrender. In this way he lost 3 games and realized that he should play 10 more. The result would be just the same, and yet he was unable to stop. At the very beginning of the 4th game, Luzhin pushed back the piece moved by his father, and with a shake of his head said in a confident, unchildlike voice, "The worst reply. Shigoren suggests taking the pawn." And with incomprehensible, hopeless speed, he had lost this game as well. Luzhin Sr. again laughed, and with trembling hand began to pour milk into a cut-glass tumbler, on the bottom of which lay a raspberry core, which now floated to the surface and circled, unwilling to be extracted. His son put away the board and the box on a wicker table in the corner, and having blurted a phlegmatic good night, softly closed the door behind him. "Oh, well, I should have expected something like this," said Luzhin Sr., wiping the tips of his fingers with a handkerchief. "He's not just amusing himself with chess, he's performing a sacred rite." A fat-bodied, fluffy moth with glowing eyes fell on the table after gliding with the lamp. A breeze stirred lightly through the garden. The clock in the drawing-room started to chime daintily and struck 12. "Nonsense," he said. "Stupid imagination. Many youngsters are excellent chess players. Nothing surprising in that. The whole affair is getting on my nerves, that's all. Bad of her. She shouldn't have encouraged him. Well, no matter." He thought drearily that in a moment he would have had to lie, to remonstrate, to soothe, and it was midnight already. "I want to sleep," he said, but remained sitting in the armchair. And early next morning, in the darkest and mossiest corner of the dense coppice behind the garden, little Luzhin buried his father's precious box of chessmen, assuming this to be the simplest way of avoiding any kind of complications, for now there were to be other chessmen that he could use openly. His father, unable to suppress his interest in the matter, went off to see the gloomy country doctor, who was far better chess player than he, and in the evening after dinner, laughing and rubbing his hands, doing his best to ignore the fact that this was all very wrong, but why wrong he could not say. He sat his son down with the doctor at the wicker table on the veranda, himself set out the pieces, apologizing for the purple thingum, sat down beside the players, and began avidly following the game. Twitching his bushy eyebrows and tormenting his fleshy nose with a large hairy fist, the doctor thought long over every move, and from time to time would lean back in his chair as if to see better from the distance, and make big eyes, and then lurch heavily forward, his hands braced against his knees. He lost and grunted so loudly that his wicker armchair creaked in response. "But look, look!" exclaimed Luzhin Sr. "You should go this way, and everything is saved. You even have the better position. Don't you see I'm in check?" growled the doctor in a bass voice, and began to set out the pieces anew. And when Luzhin Sr. went out in the dark garden to accompany the doctor, as far as the footpath with its border of glowworms leading down to the bridge, he heard the words he'd so thirsted to hear once, but now these words weighed heavily upon him. He would rather not have heard them at all. The doctor started coming every night, and since he was really a first-rate player, he derived enormous pleasure from these incessant defeats. He brought Luzhin a chess handbook, advising him, however, not to get too carried away by it, not to tire himself, and to read in the open air. He spoke about the grand masters he had had the occasion to see, about a recent tournament, but also about the passive chess, and about somewhat doubtful Raja, and about the great Philidor, who was also an accomplished musician. At times, grinning gloomily, he would bring what he termed a sugar plum, an ingenious problem cut out of some periodical. Luzhin would pore over it a while, find finally the solution, and with an extraordinary expression on his face and radiant bliss in his eyes would exclaim, blurring his R's, "How glorious, how glorious!" But the notion of composing problems himself did not entice him. He dimly felt that they would be a pointless waste of militant, charging, bright force he sensed within him, whenever the doctor, with strokes of his hairy finger, removed his cane farther and farther, and finally nodded his head and sat there quite still, looking at the board, while Luzhin Senior, who was always present, always craving a miracle his son's defeat, and was both frightened and overjoyed when his son Juan suffered from this complicated mixture of feelings, would seize a knight or a rook, crying that everything was not lost, and would himself sometimes play to the end a hopelessly compromised game. And thus it began, between this sequence of evenings on the veranda and the day when Luzhin's photograph appeared in St. Petersburg magazine, as if it was nothing had been. Neither the country autumn drizzling on the asters, nor the journey back to town, nor the return to school. The photograph appeared to be an October day soon after his first unforgettable performance in a chess club, and everything else that took place between the return to the town and the photograph 2 months after all was so blurry and so mixed up that later, in recalling this time, Luzhin was unable to say exactly when, for instance, that social evening had taken place at school, when in a corner, almost unnoticed by his schoolfellows, he had quietly beaten the geography teacher, a well-known amateur, or when on his father's invitation a gray-haired Jew came to dinner, a senile chess genius, who had been victorious in all the cities of the world, but now lived in idleness and poverty, purblind, with a sick heart, and having lost forever his fire, his grip, his luck. But one thing Luzhin remembered quite clearly, the fear he had experienced in school, the fear that he would learn of his gift and ridicule him, and consequently, guided by his infallible recollection, he judged that after the game played at the social evening he must not have gone to school any more, for remembering all the students of his childhood, he was unable to imagine the horrible sensation he would have experienced upon entering the classroom on the following morning and meeting those inquisitive, all-knowing eyes. He remembered, on the other hand, that after this picture appeared he refused to go to school, and it was impossible to entangle in his memory the knot in which the social evening and the photograph were joined. It was impossible to say which came first and which second. It was his father who brought him the magazine and the photograph, with one taken the previous year on the country, a tree in the garden next to it, a pattern of foliage on his forehead, a sullen expression on his slightly inclined face, and those narrow white shorts that always used to come unbuttoned in the front. Instead of the joy expected by his father, he expressed nothing, but he did feel a secret joy. Now this would put an end to school. They pleaded with him during the course of the week. His mother, of course, cried. His father threatened to take away his new chess set, enormous pieces on a Morocco board. And suddenly everything was decided of itself. He ran away from home in his autumn coat, since his winter one had been hidden after one unsuccessful attempt to run away, and not knowing where to go. A stinging snow was falling and settling on the cornices, and the wind would blow it off, endlessly reenacting this miniature blizzard. He wandered finally to his aunt's place, not having seen her since spring. He met her as she was leaving. She was wearing a black hat and holding flowers wrapped in paper on her way to a funeral. "Your old partner is dead," she said. "Come with me." Angry at not being allowed to warm himself, angry at the snow falling, and at the sentimental tears shining behind his aunt's veil, he turned sharply and walked away, and after walking for about half an hour, set off for home. He did not remember the actual return, and even more curiously, he was never sure whether things had happened thus or differently. Perhaps his memory later added much that was taken from his delirium, for he was delirious for a whole week, and since he was extremely delicate and high-strung, the doctors presumed he would not pull through. It was not the first he had been ill. When later reconstructing the sensation of this particular illness, he involuntarily recalled others of which his childhood had been full. He remembered especially the time when he was quite small, playing all alone and wrapping himself up in the tiger rug to represent rather forlornly a king. It was nicest of all to represent a king, since the imaginary mantle protected him against the chills of fever, and he wanted to postpone for as long as possible that inevitable moment when they would feel his forehead, take his temperature, and then bundle him to bed. Actually, there had been nothing quite comparable to his October chess-permeated illness. The gray-haired Jew who used to beat Chigorin, the corpse of his aunt's admirer muffled in flowers, the sly gay countenance of his father bringing in a magazine, and the geography teacher, petrified with the suddenness of the mate, and the tobacco smoke filled the room at the chess club, where he was closely surrounded by a crowd of university students, the clean-shaven face of the musician holding for some reason the telephone receiver like a violin between the shoulder and the cheek. All this participated in his delirium, and took on the semblance of a kind of monstrous game on a spectral, wobbly, and endlessly disintegrating board. Upon his recovery, a taller and thinner boy, he was taken abroad, at first to the Adriatic coast, where he lay on the garden terrace in the sun and played games in his head which nobody could forbid him, and then to a German resort where his father took him for walks along footpaths, fenced off with twisted beech railings. 16 years later, when he revisited the resort, he recognized the bearded earthenware dwarfs between the flower beds, and the garden paths of the colored gravel before the hotel that had grown bigger and handsomer, and also the dark damp wood on the hill and the motley daubs of oil paint, each hue marking the direction of a given walk, with which a beech trunk or a rock would be equipped at an intersection, so that the stroller would not lose his way. The same paperweights bearing emerald blue views, touched up with mother of pearl beneath complex glass, were on sale in the shops near the spring, and no doubt the same orchestra on the stand in the park was playing potpourris of opera, and the same maples were casting their lively shade over small tables where people drank coffee and ate wedge-shaped slices of apple tart with whipped cream. "Look, do you see those windows?" he said, pointing with his cane at the wing of the hotel. "It was there we had that pretty little tournament. Some of the most respectable German players took part. I was a boy of 14. Third prize, yes, third prize." He replaced both hands on the crook of his thick cane, and with that sad, slightly old-manish gesture that was natural to him now, bent his head as if listening to distant music. "What? Put on my hat? The sun is scorching, you say? I'd say it is ineffective. Why should you fuss about it? We are sitting in the shade." Nevertheless, he took the straw hat extended to him across the little table, drummed on the bottom where there was a blurred dark spot over the hatmaker's name, and donned it with a wry smile, wry in the precise sense. His right cheek and the corner of his mouth went up slightly, exposing bad tobacco-stained teeth. He had no other smile, and one would never have said that he was only beginning his fourth decade. From the wings of his nose there descended two deep, flabby furrows, his shoulders were bent, and in the whole of his body one remarked one unhealthily heaviness, and when he rose abruptly, with raised elbow, defending himself from a wasp, one saw that he was rather stout. Nothing in the little Luzhin had foreshadowed this lazy, unhealthy fleshiness. "But why does it pester me?" he cried, in a thin, querulous voice, continuing to lift his elbow and endeavoring with his other hand to get out of his handkerchief. The wasp, having described one last circle, flew away, and he followed it with his eyes for a long time, mechanically shaking out his handkerchief. Then he set his metal chair more firmly on the gravel, picked up his fallen cane, and sat down again, breathing heavily. "Why are you laughing? Wasps are extremely unpleasant insects." Frowning, he looked down at the table. Beside his cigarette case lay a handbag circular, made of black silk. He reached out for it absently and began to click the lock. "Shuts badly," he said without looking up. "One fine day you'll spill everything out." He sighed, laid the handbag aside, and added in the same tone of voice, "Yes, the most respectable German players, and one Austrian. My late papa was unlucky. He hoped there would be no real interest in chess here, and we landed right in a tournament." Things had been rebuilt and jumbled, and the wing of the house now looked different. They lived over there on the second floor. It had been decided to stay until the end of the year and then return to Russia. The ghost of school, where his father dared not mention, again loomed into view. His mother went back into much earlier. At the beginning of summer, she said she was insanely homesick for the Russian countryside, and that protracted insanely with such plaintive, aching middle syllable was practically the sole intonation of hers that Luzhin retained in his memory. She left reluctantly, however, not really knowing whether to go or stay. It was already some time since she had begun to experience a strange feeling of estrangement from her son, as if he had drifted away somewhere, and the one she loved was not this grown-up boy, not the chess prodigy that the newspapers were writing about, but that little warm, unsupportable child who at the slightest provocation would throw himself flat on the floor, screaming and drumming his feet. And everything was so sad and so unnecessary, and that sparse un-Russian lilac in the station garden, those tulip-shaped lamps in the sleeping car, the Nord Express, and those sinking sensations in the chest, a feeling of suffocation, perhaps angina pectoris, and perhaps, as her husband said, simply nerves. She went away and did not write. His father grew gayer and moved to a smaller room. And then one July day, when little Luzhin was on his way home from another hotel, in which lived one of those morose elderly men who were his playmates, accidentally in the bright low sun, he caught sight of his father by the wooden railings of a hillside path. His father was with a lady, and since that lady was certainly his young red-haired aunt from St. Petersburg, he was very surprised and somehow ashamed that he did not say anything to his father. Early one morning, a few days after this, he heard his father swiftly approach from his room along a corridor, apparently laughing loudly. The door was burst open, and his father entered, holding out a slip of paper as if thrusting it away. Tears rolled down his cheeks and along his nose as if he had splashed his face with water, and he kept repeating with sobs and gasps, "What's this? What's this? It's a mistake. They've got it wrong," and continued to thrust away the telegram. 5. He played in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Nizhny Novgorod, Kiev, Odessa. There appeared a certain Valentinov, a cross between tutor and manager. Luzhin Sr. wore a black armband, mourning for his wife, and told provincial journalists that he would never have made such a thorough survey of his native land had he not had a prodigy for a son. He battled at tournaments with the best Russian players. He often took on a score of amateurs. Sometimes he played blind. Luzhin Sr. many years later, in the years when his every contribution to immigrant newspapers seemed to him to be his own swan song, and goodness knows how many of these swan songs there were, full of lyricisms and misprints, planned to write a novella about precisely such a chess-playing small boy, who was taken from city to city by his foster father in the novella. He began to write it in 1928 after returning home from the meeting of the Union of Immigrant Writers, at which he had been the only one to turn up. The idea of the book came to him unexpectedly and vividly. He was sitting and waiting in the conference room of a Berlin coffee house. As usual, he had come very early, expressed surprise that the tables had not been placed together, told the waiters to do this immediately and ordered tea and a pony of brandy. The room was clean and brightly lit, with a still life on the wall representing plump peaches around a watermelon minus one wedge. A clean tablecloth ballooned gently and settled over the connected tables. He put a lump of sugar in his tea, and watching the bubbles rise warmed his bloodless, always cold hands on the glass. Nearby in the bar, a violin and piano were playing selections from La Traviata, and the sweet music, the brandy, the whiteness of the clean tablecloth, all this made Luzhin so sad, and this sadness was so pleasant that he was loath to move, so he just sat there, one elbow propped on the table, a finger pressed to his temple, a gaunt, red-eyed old man, wearing a knitted waistcoat under his brown jacket. The music played, the empty room was flooded with light, the wound of the watermelon glowed scarlet, and nobody seemed to be coming to the meeting. Several times he looked at his watch, and when the tea and the music bemisted him so mellowly that he forgot about the time, he sat quietly thinking about this and that, about a typewriter he had acquired second-hand, about the Mariinsky Theater, about the sun he so rarely came to Berlin. And then he suddenly realized that he had been sitting there for an hour, that the tablecloth was still just as bare and white, and in this luminous solitude that seemed to him almost mystical, sitting at a table prepared for a meeting that did not take place, he forthwith decided that after a long absence literary inspiration had revisited him. Time to do a little summing up, he thought, and looked around the empty room, tablecloth, blue wallpaper, still life, the way one looks at a room when a famous man was born, and old Luzhin mentally invited his future biographer, who as one came nearer to him in time became paradoxically more and more insubstantial, more and more remote, to take a good close look at this chance room where the novella The Gambit had been evolved. He drank the rest of his tea in one gulp, donned his coat and hat, and learned from the waiter that today was Tuesday and not Wednesday, smiled not without a certain satisfaction over his own absent-mindedness, and immediately upon returning home removed the black metal cover from his typewriter. The most vivid thing standing before his eyes was the following recollection, slightly retouched by a writer's imagination: a bright hall, 2 rows of tables, chessboards, and the tables. A person sits at each table, and at the back of each sitter spectators stand in a cluster, craning their necks. And now down the aisle between the tables, looking at no one, hurries a small boy dressed like a Tsarevich. In an elegant white sailor suit, he stops in turn at each board and quickly makes a move, or else lapses briefly in thought, inclining his golden brown head. An onlooker, knowing nothing about the simultaneous chess, would be utterly baffled at the sight of these elderly men in black, sitting gloomily behind boards that bristle thickly with curiously cut mannequins, while a nimble, smartly dressed lad, whose presence here is inexplicable, walks lightly from table to table in strange tense silence, the only one to move among these petrified people. The writer Luzhin did not himself notice the stylized nature of this recollection, nor did he notice that he endowed in his son with the features of a musical rather than a chess-playing prodigy, the result being both sickly and angelic eyes, strangely veiled, curly hair, and a transparent pallor. But now he was faced with certain difficulties. The image of his son, purged of all alien matter, and carried to the limits of tenderness, had to be surrounded with some sort of habitus. One thing he decided for sure: he would not let this child grow up, would not transform him into that taciturn person who sometimes called upon him in Berlin, replied to questions monosyllabically, sat there with his eyes half closed, and then went away, leaving an envelope with money in it on the windowsill. "He will die young," he said aloud, pacing restlessly about the room and around the open typewriter, whose keys were all watching him with their pupils of reflected light. "Yes, he will die young. His death will be logical and very moving. He will die in bed while playing his last game." He was so taken with this thought that he regretted the impossibility of beginning the writing of the book from the end. But as a matter of fact, was it impossible? One could try. He started to guide his thought backwards, from this touching and so distinct death, back to his hero's vague origin. But presently he thought better of it and sat down at his desk to ponder anew. His son's gift had developed in full only after the war, when the Wunderkind turned into the Maestro. In 1914, on the very eve of that war which so hindered his memories from ministering to a neat literary plot, he had again gone abroad with his son, and Valentinov went too. Little Luzhin was invited to play in Vienna, Budapest, and Rome. The fame of the Russian boy, who had already beaten one or two of those players whose names appear in chess textbooks, was growing so fast that his own modest literary fame was also beginning incidentally alluded to in foreign newspapers. All three of them were in Switzerland when Austrian Archduke was killed. Out of quite casual considerations, the notion that the mountain air was good for his son, Valentinov's remark that Russia had no time for chess, while his son was kept alive solely by chess, the thought that the war would not last for long, he had returned to St. Petersburg alone. After a few months, he could stand it no longer and sent for his son. In a bizarre orotund letter that was somehow matched by his roundabout journey, Valentinov informed him that his son did not wish to come. Luzhin wrote again, and the reply, just as orotund and polite, came not from Tarasp, but from Nebli. He began to loathe Valentinov. There were days of extraordinary anguish. There were absurd complications with the transfer of money. However, Valentinov proposed in one of his next letters to assume all the cost of the boy's maintenance himself. They would settle up later. Time passed. In the unexpected role of war correspondent, he found himself in the Caucasus. Days of anguish and keen hatred for Valentinov, who wrote, however diligently, were followed by days of mental peace derived from the feeling that life abroad was good for his son, better than it would have been in Russia, which was precisely what Valentinov affirmed. Now, a decade and a half later, these war years turned out to be an exasperating obstacle. They seemed an encroachment upon creative freedom, for in every book describing the gradual development of a given human personality, one had somehow to mention the war, and even the hero's dying in his youth could not provide a way out of the situation. There was characters and circumstances surrounding his son's image that unfortunately were conceivable only against the background of the war, and which could not have existed without this background. With the revolution it was even worse. The general opinion was that it had influenced the course of every Russian life. An author could not have had his hero go through it without getting scorched, and to judge it was impossible. This amounted to a genuine violation of the writer's free will. Actually, how could the revolution affect his son? On the long-awaited day, in the fall of 1917, Valentinov appeared just as cheerful, loud, and magnificently dressed as before, and behind him was the pudgy young man with a rudimentary moustache. There was a moment of sorrow, embarrassment, and strange disillusionment. The son hardly spoke, and kept glancing askance at the window. "He's afraid there might be someone shooting," explained Valentinov in a low voice. All this resembled a bad dream at first, but one gets used to everything. Valentinov continued to assert that whatever was owed to him could be settled among friends later. It turned out that he had important secret business affairs and monies tucked away in all the banks and lied to Europe. Young Luzhin began to frequent an eminently quiet chess club that had trustfully blossomed forth at the very height of civil chaos, and in spring, together with Valentinov, he disappeared, once more abroad. After this came recollections that were purely personal, unbidden recollections of no use to him. Starvation, arrest, and so forth, and suddenly, legal exile, blessed expulsion, the clean yellow deck, the Baltic breeze, the discussion with Professor Vasilenko over the immortality of the soul. Out of all this, out of all the crude mishmash that stuck to the pin and tumbled out at every corner of his memory, degrading every recollection and blocking the way for free thought, he was unavoidably compelled to extract carefully and piece by piece and admit whole to his book, Valentinov, a man of undoubted talent, as he was characterized by those who were about to say something nasty about him, an odd fellow, a jack of all trades, an indispensable man for the organization of amateur shows, engineer, superb mathematician, chess and checkers enthusiast, and the amusingest gentleman, in the words of his own recommendation. He had wonderful brown eyes, an extraordinarily attractive laugh. On his index finger he wore a death's head ring, and he gave one to understand that there had been a duelist in his life. At one time he had taught calisthenics, in Little Luzhin school, and pupils and teachers alike had been much impressed by the fact that a mysterious lady used to come for him in a limousine. He invented in passing an amazing metallic pavement that was tried in St. Petersburg on the Nevsky near Kazan Cathedral. He had composed several clever chess problems and was the first exponent of the so-called Russian theme. He was 28 the year war was declared and suffered from no illness. The anemic word deserter somehow did not suit this cheerful, sturdy, agile man. No other word, however, can be found for it. What he did abroad during the war remained unknown. And so Luzhin, the writer decided to utilize him in full. Thanks to his presence, any story acquired extraordinary liveliness, a smack of adventure, but the most important part still remained to be invented. Everything he had up to now was the coloration, warm and vivid in doubt. But floating in separate spots, he had still to find a definite design, a sharp line. For the first time, the writer Luzhin had involuntarily begun with colors. And the brighter these colors became in his mind, the harder it was to sit down at the typewriter. A month went by and another, and summer began, and still he continued to clothe this yet invisible theme in the most festive hues. Sometimes it seemed that the book was already written, and clearly he saw the set-up type, the gallery-proof skulls with red hieroglyphs in the margin, and then the advanced copy, so fresh and crisp to the touch, and beyond that was the marvelous mist of delectable rewards for all his failures, all the fickleness of fame. He visited his numerous acquaintances, and lengthily, with great gusto, spoke of his coming book. One émigré newspaper printed a note to the effect that after a long silence he was working on a new tale, and this note, which he himself had written and sent in, he excitedly read over 3 times and then cut out and placed in his wallet. He began to appear with greater frequency at literary evenings, and he supposed that everyone must be looking at him with curiosity and respect. Once on a treacherous summer day, he went to a suburban wood, got soaked in a sudden downpour while vainly looking for bullets, and the following day took to his bed. He ailed briefly and lonesomely, and his end was not pacific. The board of the Union Émigré Writers honored his memory in a minute of silence. 6. Everything will be spilled, that's certain, said Luzhin, again taking possession of the handbag. She quickly stretched forth her hand and moved her handbag farther away, banging it down on the table, and thereby to underline the interdiction. You always have to fiddle with something, she said amicably. Luzhin looked at his hands, playing the fingers and then closing them up again. The nails, tawny with nicotine, had ragged cuticles about them. The fat little furrows ran across the finger joints, and a few hairs grew lower down. He placed his hand on the table next to her hand, milky pale and soft to look at, with short, neatly trimmed nails. I regret not having known your father, she said after a pause. He must have been very kind, very earnest, and very fond of you. Luzhin was silent. Tell me some more. How is your life here? Were you really a little boy once, running and romping about? He replaced both hands on his cane, and from the expression on his face, with a sleepy lowering of his heavy lids, and from his slightly open mouth, looking as if he were about to yawn, she concluded that he had grown bored, and that he was tired of reminiscing. And anyway, he reminisced coldly. She was puzzled that, having lost his father only a month ago, he was now able to look dry-eyed at the hotel where they had lived together during his boyhood, but even in this indifference, in his clumsy words, and in the cumbrous stirrings of his soul that seemed to be drowsily turning over and falling asleep again, she fancied she saw something pathetic, a charm that was difficult to define, but one that she had felt in him from the first day of their acquaintance. And how mysterious it was that, despite the evident tepidity of his relationship with his father, he had chosen precisely this resort and precisely this hotel, as if expecting to receive from these once-seen objects and landscapes the tingle he was unable to experience without outside assistance. And he had arrived magnificently on a gray and green day in a drizzling rain, wearing a disgraceful black, shaggy hat and huge rubbers, and looking through the window at his figure as he clambered ponderously out of the hotel bus. She had felt that this unknown newcomer was someone quite special, unlike any other resident at the resort. That same evening she learned who he was. Everybody in the restaurant looked at the stout, gloomy man who ate greedily and sloppily, and sometimes became lost in thought, one finger stroking the tablecloth. She did not play chess, took no interest in chess tournaments, but somehow or other his name was familiar to her. It had unconsciously imprinted itself in her memory, though she was unable to recall when she had first heard it. A German manufacturer who was a long-time sufferer from constipation and liked to talk about it, a man with a one-track mind who was good-natured and pleasant and dressed with some taste, suddenly forgot his constipation, and in the gallery they were drinking a curative water, informed her of several amazing facts about this gloomy gentleman, who now, having exchanged his shaggy fedora with an old boater, was standing before a small display window let into one of the columns and examining some handcrafted knickknacks that were being exhibited for sale. "Your fellow countryman," said the manufacturer, indicating with a jerk of the eyebrow, "is a famous chess player. He has come from Paris for the tournament that will be held in Berlin in 2 months' time. If he wins, he'll challenge the world champion. His father recently died. It's all here in the newspaper." She wanted to make his acquaintance, talk Russian. So attractive did he seem to her, with his uncouthness, his gloominess, his low, turned-down collar, which for some reason made him look like a musician. And she was pleased that he did not take any notice of her, and seek an excuse to talk to her, as did all the other single men in the hotel. She was not particularly pretty. There was something lacking in her small, regular features, as if the last decisive jog that would have made her beautiful, leaving her features the same but endowing them but inevitable significance, had not been given them by nature. But she was 25. Her fashionably bobbed hair was neat and lovely, and she had one turn of her head which betrayed a hint of possible harmony, a promise of real beauty that at the last moment remained unfulfilled. She wore extremely simple and extremely well-cut dresses that left her arms and neck bare, as if she were flaunting a little of their tender freshness. She was rich. Her father had lost a fortune in Russia and made another in Germany. Her mother was due soon at the resort, and since the advent of Luzhin, the thought of her fussy arrival had become unpleasant. She made his acquaintance on the 3rd day after his arrival, made it the way they do in old novels or in motion pictures. She drops a handkerchief and he picks it up, with the sole difference that they interchanged roles. Luzhin was walking along a path in front of her, and in succession shed a large checked handkerchief that was unusually dirty, and had all sorts of pocket debris sticking to it, that a broken and crushed cigarette minus half of its contents, a nut, and a French franc. She gathered up only the handkerchief and the coin, and walked on, slowly catching up with him, and curiously awaiting some new loss. With the cane he carried in his right hand, Luzhin touched, in passing every tree trunk and every bench, while groping in his pocket with his left, until finally he stopped, turned out his coat pocket, shed another coin, and started to examine the large hole in the lining. "Right through," he said in German, taking the handkerchief from her hand. "This also," she said in Russian. "Poor material," he continued without looking up, neither switching to Russian nor showing any surprise, as if the return of his things had been quite natural. "Oh, don't put them back there," she said with a sudden peal of laughter. Only then did he lift his head and glance morosely at her. His puffy gray face, with its badly shaven, razor-nicked cheeks, acquired a strange expression of bewilderment. He had wonderful eyes. They were narrow, even slightly slanting, as if sprinkled with dust under their drooping lids, but through that fluffy dust there showed a moist bluish gleam, containing something insane and attractive. "Don't drop them again," she said, and walked away, feeling his glance on her back. That evening, as she entered the restaurant, she could not help smiling at him from afar, and he responded with the same gloomy, crooked half-smile he sometimes bestowed on the hotel cat as it slipped noiselessly along the floor from one table to the other. And on the following day, in the hotel garden, among the grottos, fountains, earthenware dwarfs, he went up to her and began in his deep, melancholy voice to thank her for the handkerchief and the coin, and from that time, dimly and almost unconsciously, he constantly watched to see whether she would drop anything, as if trying to re-establish some secret symmetry. "Don't mention it," she replied, and added many similar words, the poor relations of real words, and how many there are of them. These little throwaway words that are spoken hurriedly and temporarily fill the void. Employing such words and feeling their petty vapidity, she asked him if he liked the resort. Was he there for long, and did he like the waters? He replied that he did, was for long, and took the waters. Then, fully aware of the stupidity of the question, but incapable of stopping herself, she asked how long he had been playing chess. He gave no answer and was turned away, and she felt so embarrassed that she began to reel off a list of all the meteorological indications for yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He continued silent, and she also fell silent, and then she began to rummage in her handbag, searching agonizingly for a topic, and finding only a broken comb. Suddenly he turned his face to her and said, 18 years, 3 months, and 4 days. For her this was an exquisite relief, and furthermore, she was somehow flattered by the elaborate circumstantiality of his reply. Subsequently, however, she began to grow a little annoyed that he, in his turn, never asked any questions, taking her, as it were, for granted. An artist, a great artist, she frequently thought, contemplating his heavy profile, his corpulent, hunched body, the dark lock of hair clinging to his always moist forehead, and perhaps it was precisely because she knew nothing at all about chess that chess for her was not simply a parlor game or a pleasant pastime, but a mysterious art equal to all the recognized arts. She had never been in close contact with such people. There was no one to compare him with, except those inspired eccentrics, musicians and poets whose image one knows as clearly and vaguely as that of a Roman emperor, an inquisitor, or a comedy miser. Her memory contained a modest, dimly lit gallery, with a sequence of all the people who had in any way caught her fancy. Here were her school reminiscences, the girls' school in St. Petersburg, with an unusual bit of ivy in its frontage that ran along a short, dusty, tramless street, and the geography teacher, who also taught in a boys' school, a large-eyed man with a very white forehead and tousled hair, suffering, as they said, from tuberculosis, once a guest, they said, of Dalai Lama. In love, they said, with one of the upper form girls, a niece of the white-haired, blue-eyed headmistress, whose tidy little office was so cozy with its blue wallpaper and white Dutch stove, and it was precisely on a blue background surrounded by blue air that the old geography teacher had remained in her memory. He would dash noisily into the classroom in his usual impulsive manner and then melt away and vanish, yielding his place to another person, who also seemed to her unlike all the rest. The appearance of this person was preceded by lengthy admonitions on the part of the headmistress not to laugh, not on any account to laugh. This was the first year of the Soviet regime. Out of 40 pupils in the class, only 17 remained, and every day they met the teachers with the question, "Will there be lessons today?" And the latter invariably replied, "We still haven't received final instructions. The headmistress ordered there to be no giggles when the man came for the commissarist, from the popular education, whatever he might say and however he might behave himself, and he came and took up his abode in her memory as extraordinarily amusing person, a visitor from a different absurd world." He was lame but very lively and squirmy, with quick flickering eyes. The girls were crowded in the hushed hall, and he walked back and forth in front of them, limping briskly and turning with simian agility. As he limped past them, nimbly dragging his foot on its double heel with his right hand, cutting the air up into regular slices or else smoothing it out like cloth, he spoke swiftly and at length about the lectures in sociology he would be giving and about imminent merger with a boys' school, and restrained laughter made one's jaws ache and caused spasms in one's throat. And later in Finland, which had remained in her heart as something more Russian than Russia, perhaps because of the wooden villa and the fir trees and the white boat on the lake, black with the reflected conifers, were especially Russian, being treasured as something forbidden on the far side of the frontier. And this Finland, which was still vacation land, still part St. Petersburg life, she saw several times from afar a celebrated writer, a very pale man with very conspicuous goatee, who kept glancing up at the sky with enemy airplanes, had begun to haunt, and he remained in some strange manner beside the Russian officer who subsequently lost an arm in the Crimea during the Civil War, a most shy and retiring boy, with whom she used to play tennis in summer and ski in winter. And with this snowy recollection there would float up once more against a background of night the celebrated writer's villa in which he later died, and the clear path in the snowdrifts, illuminated by this electric light, phantasmal stripes on the dark snow. These men with their various occupations, each of whom tinted her recollection as his own particular color, blue geographer, khaki commissar, the writer's black overcoat, and a youth in all white, lobbing a fur cone with his tennis racket, were followed by glinting and dissolving images, immigrant life in Berlin, charity balls, monarchist meetings, and lots of identical people. All this was still so close to her memory was unable to focus properly and sort out what was valuable and what was rubbish, and moreover there was no time now to sort it out. Too much space had been taken up by this taciturn, fabulous, enigmatical man, the most attractive of all the men she had known. His very art and all the manifestations and signs of his art were mysterious. She quickly learned in the evenings after supper he worked until late at night. But this work was beyond the powers of her imagination, since there was nothing to link it to, neither an easel nor a piano, and it was just such a definite emblem of art that her thoughts reached out for. His room was on the first floor, and the men with cigars strolling in the darkness of the garden sometimes glimpsed his lamp and his inclined face. Somebody told her finally that he sat in an empty chessboard. She wanted to look for herself, and one night, soon after their first conversation, she made her way along the footpath between the oleander bushes to his window, but feeling a sudden awkwardness, she went straight by without looking, and came into the avenue where she could hear music coming from the Kursaal, and then, unable to master her curiosity, went back again to the window, this time deliberately making a gravel creak so as to convince herself that she was not spying. His window was open, the blind unlowered, and in the bright depth of the room she saw him take off his jacket, tense his neck muscles, and yawn, and in the slow, massive motion of his shoulder, the image of which continued to heave and turn before her eyes, as she hastily walked away in the darkness toward the illuminated terrace of the hotel, she fancied the presence of a mighty fatigue after undivulged but surely miraculous labors. Luzhin was indeed tired. Lately he had been playing too frequently and too unsystematically. He was particularly fatigued by playing blind, or rather well-played performance that he willingly gave. He found therein deep enjoyment. One did not deal with invisible, audible, palpable pieces whose quaint shape and wooden materiality always disturbed him and always seemed to him but the crude mortal shell of exquisite, invisible chess forces. When playing blind, he was able to sense these diverse forces in their original purity. He saw then neither the knight's carved mane nor the glossy heads of the pawns, but he felt quite clearly that this or that imaginary square was occupied by a definite, concentrated force, so that he envisioned the movement of a piece as a discharge, a shock, a stroke of lightning, and that the whole chess field quivered with tension, and over this tension he was sovereign, here gathering, and in there releasing electric power. Thus he played against 15, 20, 30 opponents in the course of sheer number of boards told, since it affected the actual playing time, but this physical weariness was nothing compared to the mental fatigue, retribution for the stress and rapture involved in the game itself, which he conducted in a celestial dimension, where his tools were incorporeal quantities. He also found a certain solace in these blind games, and the victories they afforded him, for in recent years he had been having no luck at international tournaments. A ghostly barrier had arisen that kept preventing him from coming first. Valentinov had happened to foretell this in the past shortly before they parted. "Shine while you can," he had said after that unforgettable tournament in London, the first after the war, when the 20-year-old Russian player came out the victor. "While you can," repeated Valentinov slyly, "because you won't be a boy prodigy much longer." And this was very important for Valentinov. He was interested in Luzhin only inasmuch as he remained a freak, an odd phenomenon, somewhat deformed but enchanting like a dachshund's crooked legs. During the whole time that he lived with Luzhin, he unremittingly encouraged and developed his grief, not bothering for a second about Luzhin as a person whom it seemed not only Valentinov but life itself had overlooked. He showed him to wealthy people as an amusing monster, acquired useful contacts through him, and organized innumerable tournaments, and only when he began to suspect that his prodigy was turning simply into a young chess player did he bring him back to his father in Russia, and afterwards, like a kind of valuable, he took him away again, and when he thought that perhaps he had made a mistake, that the freak still had a year or two of life left in him. When even this span had run out, he made a gift to Luzhin of some money, the way one does to a mistress he is tired of, and disappeared, finding fresh amusement in the movie business, that mysterious astrological business where they read scripts and look for stars. After having departed to the sphere of jaunty, quick-talking, self-important co-men, with their patter about the philosophy of the screen, the taste of the masses, and the intimacy of the movie camera, and with pretty good word comes the same time, he dropped out of Luzhin's world, which for Luzhin was a relief, the odd kind of relief you get in resolving an unhappy love affair. He had become attached to Valentinov immediately, as early as the days of his chess tours in Russia, and later he regarded him the way a son might a frivolous, coldish, elusive father to whom one could never say how much one loved them. Valentinov was interested in him only as a chess player. At times he heard about him something of the trainer who hovers about an athlete, establishing a definite regime with merciless severity. Thus Valentinov asserted that it was all right for a chess player to smoke, since there was in both chess and smoking a touch of the East, but not in any circumstances to drink, and during their life together in the dining rooms of large hotels, enormous hotels deserted in wartime, in chance restaurants, in Swiss inns and Italian trattorie, he invariably ordered mineral water for young Luzhin. The food he chose for him was light so that his brain could function freely, but for some reason, perhaps also because of a hazy connection with the East, he encouraged Luzhin a great deal in his passion for sweets. Finally, he had a peculiar theory that the development of Luzhin's gift for chess was connected with the development of the sexual urge, that with him chess represented a special deflection of this urge, and fearing lest Luzhin could squander this precious power by releasing by natural means the beneficial inner tension, he kept him at a distance from women and rejoiced over his chaste moroseness. There was something degrading in all this. Luzhin, recalling that time, was surprised to note that not a single kind, humane word had passed between him and Valentinov. Nevertheless, then, 3 years after their final departure from Russia, that land had grown so unpleasant, Valentinov had vanished. He experienced a feeling of emptiness, a lack of support, and he acknowledged the inevitability of what had happened, sighed, turned around, and again was lost in thought over the chessboard. After the war, tournaments began to increase. He played in Manchester, where the decrepit champion of England forced to draw after a 2-day struggle, in Amsterdam, where he lost the deciding game because he exceeded the time limit, and his opponent, with an excited grunt, banged down the stop of Luzhin's clock, in Rome, where Turati triumphantly unleashed his celebrated debut, and many other cities which for him were all identical, hotel, taxi, a hall in a cafe or club. These cities, these regular rows of blurry lamps, marching past and suddenly advancing and encircling a stone horse in a square, were as much a habitual and unnecessary integument as the wooden pieces in the black and white board, and he accepted his external life as something inevitable but completely uninteresting. Similarly, in his way of dressing in the matter of his everyday life, he was prompted by extremely dim motives, stopping to think about nothing, rarely changing his linen, automatically winding his watch at night, shaving with the same safety blade until it ceased to cut altogether, and feeding haphazardly and plainly. From some kind of melancholy inertia, he continued to order at dinner the same mineral water, which effervesced slightly in his sinuses and evoked a tickling sensation in the corners of his eyes, like tears for the vanished Valentinov. Only rarely did he notice his own existence, when, for example, lack of breath, the revenge of a heavy body, forced him to halt with open mouth on a staircase, or when he had a toothache, or when at late hour during the chess cogitations, and outstretched hands shaking a matchbox failed to evoke in it the rattle of matches, and the cigarette seemed to have been thrust unnoticed into his mouth by someone else, suddenly grew and asserted itself solid, soulless, and static, and his whole life became concentrated in a single desire to smoke, although goodness knows how many cigarettes he had already been unconsciously consumed. And general life around him was so opaque and demanded so little effort of him that it sometimes seemed someone, a mysterious, invisible manager, continued to take him from tournament to tournament, but occasionally there were odd moments, such quietness all around, and when you looked out into the corridor, shoes, 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 standing at all the doors, and in your ears the roar of loneliness. When his father was still alive, Luzhin used to think with a sinking feeling about his arrival in Berlin, about the necessity of seeing his father, helping him, talking to him, and his cheerful-looking old man with his knitted waistcoat, clapping him clumsily on the shoulder with intolerance to him, like a shameful recollection that you try to throw off, screwing up your eyes and moaning through your teeth. He did not come from Paris for his father's funeral, fearing above all corpses, coffins, wreaths, and responsibility connected with all this, but he came later, set off for the cemetery, tramped around in the rain among the graves and mud-caked rubbers, failed to find his father's grave, and behind some trees caught sight of a man who was probably the caretaker, but a strange feeling of inertia and shyness prevented him from inquiring. He raised his collar and plodded back over a patch of waste ground toward the waiting taxi. His father's death did not interrupt his work. He was getting ready for the Berlin tournament, with the definite idea of finding the best defense against the complex opening of the Italian Turati, who was the most awesome of the future participants in the tournament. This player, a representative of the latest fashions in chess, opens the game by moving up on the flanks, leaving the middle of the board unoccupied by pawns, but exercising a most dangerous influence on the center from the sides, scorning the cozy safety of castling. He strove to create the most unexpected and whimsical interrelations between his men. Luzhin had already met him once and lost, and his defeat particularly rankled because Turati, by temperament, by his style of play and his proclivity for fantastic arrayals, was a player with a kindred mentality to his own, and only Turati had gone further. Luzhin's game, which in his early youth had so astounded the experts with its unprecedented boldness and disregard for the basic, as it seemed, rules of chess, now appeared just a little old-fashioned compared with the glittering extremism of Turati. Luzhin's present plight was that of a writer or a composer who, having assimilated the latest things in art at the beginnings of its active career, and caused a temporary sensation with the originality of his devices, all at once notices a change has imperceptibly taken place around him, that others, sprung from goodness knows where, have left him behind the very devices which he recently led the way, and that he feels himself robbed, sees only ungrateful imitators and the bold artists who have overtaken him, and seldom understands that he himself is to blame, he who had petrified in this art, which was once new but is now advanced since then. Looking back over his 18 and more years of chess, Luzhin saw an accumulation of victories at the beginning and then a strange lull, bursts of victories here and there, but in general irritating and hopeless draws, thanks to which he imperceptibly learned the reputation of a cautious, impenetrable, prosaic player. And this was strange. The bolder his imagination, the livelier his invention during his secret work between matches, the more oppressive became his feeling of helplessness when the contest began, and the more timidly and circumspectly he played. Having long ago entered the ranks of international grandmasters, extremely well known, cited in all chess textbooks, a candidate among 5 or 6 others for the title of world champion, he owed his flattering reputation to his early performances, which had left around him a kind of indistinct light, the halo of the chosen, a haze of glory. His father's death presented itself to him as a landmark by which to measure the road he had traveled, and looking back he saw with something of a shudder how slowly he had been going of late, and having seen it he plunged with gloomy passion into new calculations, inventing and already vaguely sensing the harmony of the moves he needed, a dazzling defense. He had been unwell that night in a Berlin hotel after his trip to the cemetery, palpitations of the heart and queer thoughts, and a feeling that his brain had gone numb and been varnished over. The doctor he saw in the morning advised him to take a rest, to go to some quiet place where the greenery is all around, said the doctor, and Luzhin, cancelling a promised display of blind chess, went away to the obvious place which had immediately loomed before him when the doctor referred to greenery. In fact, he felt dimly grateful to an obliging memory that indicated the necessary resort to aptly, took all the trouble on itself and put him into a ready-made, ready-waiting hotel. He did feel better amid this green scenery that was moderately beautiful and transmitted a feeling of security and tranquility, and suddenly, as in a fairground booth, when a painted paper screen is burst starwise, admitting a smiling human face, there appeared from him, no one knew where, a person who was so unexpected and so familiar, and who spoke with a voice that seemed to have been sounding mutely all his life, and now had suddenly burst through the usual murk. Trying to unravel in his mind this impression of something very familiar, he recalled quite irrelevantly, but with stunning clarity, the face of a bare-shouldered, black-stockinged young prostitute standing at a lighted doorway in a dark side street in a nameless town, and in some ridiculous way it seemed to him that this was she, that she had come now, primly dressed and somewhat less pretty, as if she had washed off some bewitching make-up, that because of this he had become more accessible. This was his first impression when he saw her, when he noticed with surprise that she was actually talking to her. It irked him a little that she was not quite as good-looking as she might have been, judging by odd dreamy signs strewn about in the past. He reconciled himself to this and gradually began to forget her vague prototypes, and then he felt reassured and proud that here talking to him, spending her time with him and smiling at him, was a real live person. And that day on the garden terrace, where bright yellow wasps kept settling on the iron tables and moving their lowered antennae, that day when he started to speak of how he had once lived in this hotel as a small boy, Luzhin began with a series of quiet moves, the meaning of which he himself only vaguely sensed, his own peculiar declaration of love. "Go on, tell me more," she repeated, despite having noticed how morosely and dully he had fallen silent. He sat leaning on his cane and thinking with a knight's move of this time tree, standing on a sunlit slope one could take with that telegraph pole over there, and simultaneously he tried to remember what exactly he had just been talking about. A waiter with a dozen empty beer mugs hanging from his crooked fingers ran along the wing of the building, and Luzhin remembered with relief that he had been speaking about the tournament that once took place in that very wing. He grew agitated and hot, and the band of his hat constricted his temples, and his agitation was not quite comprehensible yet. "Let's go," he said. "I'll show you. It must be empty there now, and cool." Stepping heavily and trailing his cane, which grated along the gravel and bounced against the doorstep, he entered the door first. How ill-bred he is, she reflected, and caught herself shaking her head, and then accused herself of introducing a slightly false note. His manners had nothing at all to do with ill-breeding. "Here, I think it's this way," said Luzhin, and pushed a side door. A fire was burning, a fat man in white was shouting something, and a tower of plates ran past on human legs. "No farther," said Luzhin, and walked along the corridor. He opened another door and almost fell, steps going down and some shrubs at the bottom, and a pile of rubbish and an apprehensive hen, jerkily walking away. "I made a mistake," said Luzhin. "It's probably here to the right." He removed his hat, feeling burning beads of sweat gather on his brow. Oh, how clear was the image of that cool, empty, spacious hall, and how difficult it was to find it. "Let's try this door here," he said. The door proved to be locked. He pressed the handle down several times. "Who's there?" a hoarse voice said abruptly, and a bed creaked. "Mistake, mistake," muttered Luzhin, and went farther. Then he looked back and stopped. He was alone. "Where is she?" he said aloud, shuffling his feet as he turned this way and that. Corridor. Window giving on garden. Gadget on a wall with numbered pigeonholes. A bell whirred. In one of the pigeonholes a number popped up. Awry. He was bemused and troubled as if he had lost his way in a bad dream, and he quickly walked back, repeating under his breath, "Queer jokes, queer jokes." He came out unexpectedly into the garden, and there were two characters were sitting on a bench and looking at him curiously. Suddenly he heard laughter overhead and raised his face. She was standing on a little balcony of her room and laughing, her elbows propped on the railings, her palms pressed against her cheeks, and shaking her head with sly reproachfulness. She looked at his ample face, his hat on the back of his head, and waited to see what he could do now. "I couldn't keep up with you," she cried, straightening up and opening her arms in some kind of explanatory gesture. Luzhin lowered his head and entered the building. She supposed that in a moment he would knock on her door, and she decided not to let him in, and say the room was untidy, but he did not knock. When she went down to supper, he was not in the dining room. "He's taken offense," she decided, and went to bed earlier than usual. In the morning she went out for a walk and looked to see if he was waiting in the garden, reading his newspaper on a bench as usual. He was not in the garden. He was not in the gallery. and she went for a walk without him. When he did not appear for dinner, and his table was taken by an ancient couple who had long had their eye on it, she asked if the office of Mr. Luzhin was sick. "Mr. Luzhin left this morning for Berlin," replied the girl. An hour later his baggage returned to the hotel. The janitor and a bellboy, with a matter-of-fact indifference, carried in the bags which that morning they had carried out. Luzhin was returning from the station on foot, a stout, doleful gentleman, crushed by the heat in the shoes of white dust. He rested on all the benches, and once or twice plucked a blackberry, grimacing from the sourness. While walking along the highway, he noticed a fair-haired small boy following him with tiny steps, holding an empty beer bottle in his hands, lagging behind on purpose, and staring at him with unbearable childish concentration. Luzhin halted. The boy also halted. Luzhin moved. The boy moved. Then Luzhin lost his temper and threatened him with his cane. The other froze, grinning with surprise and joy. "I'll," said Luzhin in a deep voice, and went toward him with his cane raised. The small boy jumped and ran off. Grumbling to himself and breathing hard through his nose, Luzhin continued on his way. All at once an extremely well-aimed pebble hit him on the left shoulder blade. He let out a cry and turned around. Nobody, an empty road, woods, heather. "I'll kill him," he said loudly in German, and walked on faster, trying to weave from side to side that way. He had read somewhere, men do when they fear a shot in the back, and repeated his helpless threat. He was quite exhausted, panting and almost crying by the time he reached the hotel. "Changed my mind," he said, addressing the office girl as he went by. "I'm staying. Changed my